Welcome to what, by my calculation, is the 20th iteration of the Roger Hood Annual Lecture. This occasion was inaugurated back in 2006 to celebrate the life and work of Roger Hood and the contributions he made to our field. That contribution was both enormous and wide-ranging, both here in Oxford and beyond. Roger, for those of you who don't know, was the founder and director of firstly the Centre for Criminological Research, which then became the Centre for Criminology for over 3 decades, from 1973 to 2003. He oversaw the introduction of the MSc, which many people in the room are now doing, and really very much laid the foundations for the centre that as it has become today. Beyond Oxford, Roger was a prolific and influential scholar across a wide range of fields, from the history of criminal justice to sentencing to race and criminal justice, and I guess most notably the death penalty. He was the author and sometime co-author with Caroline of 5 editions of The Death Penalty, A Worldwide Perspective, and he continued to both research and to do what we've been taught to call impact and engagement on that question around the world well into his retirement. That work is now carried on today by the Death Penalty Research Unit. Until his death in 2020, Roger was ever present on these occasions, and his colleagues, I think, became rather fond of the fact that he very evidently enjoyed these events enormously, while spending the whole time protesting about the fuss that was being made in his honour and feigning embarrassment at the whole thing. We are very proud to be able to carry on this legacy after his death. I can think of few, if any, scholars more fitting to deliver the 20th version of this lecture than today's speaker, Professor Didier Fassin. Didier is Professor at the Collège of France in Paris, where he holds the chair of Moral Questions and Social Issues. He's also the James D. Wolfenson Professor of Social Science at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. Didier is an anthropologist and sociologist who has worked on what, to my mind, is an impressive array of topics, ranging from public health, the fate and condition of the social sciences, the concept of social critique, humanitarianism, through to his recent book on the world's moral abdication in the face of the crisis in Gaza. Those of you who just like hanging around in the little bit of the social sciences we call criminology will probably be more familiar with Didier's work on both policing and punishment. He is the author of Enforcing Order, an edited collection on police ethnography, and an ethnographic book on policing, which is in fact a cartoon, as far as I can tell. He's also the author of Prison Worlds and a book on the will to punish, which I've now for several years have used to both introduce and provoke our students to think more carefully and critically about what we think the thing that we call punishment is, and where it is enacted, and who enacts it, and why, and so on and so forth. So far as I understand it, he's here today to talk about his more recent book, Exile, and the projects he's engaged in recent years on the policing of borders. For reasons that will, I think, very shortly become apparent, that is also a very fitting topic for the subject of the Roger Hood Lecture. It is with great pleasure that we welcome you to Oxford.
So thank you very much for your invitation. Not being a criminologist myself, it's always an honor to be regarded as one by criminologists, as one of them, at least for a few hours, and especially here at Oxford, and especially for this named lecture. And you will see that this lecture that I will give now is directly inspired by Roger Hood's work. So among the multiple topics in criminology that Roger Hood has explored and contributed to rethink and sometimes to reform is, as was said before, capital punishment. But as Anthony Bottoms and Caroline Hoyle wrote in their biographical memoir for the British Academy, it had a distinct and even distinctive status in his intellectual career for at least 2 reasons. First, because it addressed an audience beyond the academic world, and second, because the book he drew from this research made him the leading authority internationally on the subject. So capital punishment, as is obvious, corresponds to the execution of an offender after due legal process for a serious crime. In Weberian terms, it can be described as the ultimate expression of the state's monopoly of the legitimate use of violence. In Foucauldian terms, it may be analyzed as the persistence of the sovereign power as a right to kill in a time when biopower has become prevalent. But if we consider it from that perspective, that is, the infliction of death by a sovereign state, should we restrict capital punishment to situations in which the person executed has been convicted in a criminal court? The question is all the more important that capital punishment in this exclusive form has been in decline for decades, with almost 3/4 of countries worldwide having abolished it de jure or de facto as a result of international campaigns and of changes in moral economies. But are there not situations in which state agents execute people deemed guilty of an offense even when they have not been sentenced by a court of law? As early as 1980, as you probably know, Lawrence Sherman argued in the Vanderbilt Law Review that police homicide could be interpreted as, quote, execution without trial. At the time in the United States, he observed, while there were 233 persons sentenced to death after trial in a year, with no one being executed, 590 people were killed by the police without trial. This use of deadly force could not be merely regarded as deviant or accidental acts. It was accepted by law enforcement institutions, the justice system, and society as a whole, as shown by the fact that the perpetrators of these homicides were almost never prosecuted. The state exonerated them based on the accepted doctrine that permits the use of weapons to prevent a felony or arrest someone believed to have committed one, which is extended to condoning cases where the person shot dead was only suspected of a misdemeanor or even was innocent. This is still true today, and as has been evidenced by the mobilization around police homicides since the death of Michael Brown in the United States, there is a disproportionate presence of racial minorities, especially black men, among the victims. In the United States, more than 10,400 people have been killed by the police in the past decade, while 213 were executed after being sentenced in court. That is 50 times less. And still, grand juries, exceptionally, that is, in less than 1% of cases in a recent study, indict the officers who killed. Society tolerates or excuses these homicides and is prompt to taint the victims in order to justify their punitive rationale. This is something I've recently shown in an article titled "The Politics of the Aftermath" on the sequels to police violence, about the way the killing of an adolescent by a law enforcement agent had been treated in France a year and a half ago. In this sense, such extrajudicial killings can be viewed as a form of capital punishment. This broadening of the interpretation of death penalty beyond the justice system, I want to pursue it in the case of the violence of border control. In the past decades, 74,000 migrants have lost their lives across the world, according to the International Organization for Migration, which admits that this figure is in fact quite underestimated, and to give you an example, in the journey between Morocco and the Canary Islands, which has become a very important way of reaching the European territory today, during the year 2021, the organization, International Organization for Migration, has identified 1,126 deaths, while the Spanish organization Caminando Fronteras, drawing on precise information, counted 4,016 people who lost their lives on this route. That is almost 4 times more than the official data. Although the circumstances of these tragic events vary, they are almost always a consequence of state policies. In the Sonoran Desert, since the beginning of the so-called prevention through detention program launched 3 decades ago, 4,373 persons have died as they tried to enter the United States, escaping the notorious Border Patrol. In the Calais region, after the implementation of restrictive regulation and deployment of law enforcement by the French and British governments, 369 migrants died over a 20-year period, mostly from drowning as the overcrowded dinghy sank, or sometimes after having been hit by a truck or electrocuted on a train as they attempted to cross the channel to reach England. In the Sahara, after the 2015 decision of the European Union to allocate considerable financial support to Niger on condition that it would pass and enforce a law repressing smugglers and migrants, the annual number of deaths and disappearances raised from 56 to each year, from 56 to 433. That is an almost 8-fold increase, as people took dangerous routes to avoid patrols and arrests. In the Mediterranean, ships and, and planes of the European agency Frontex pushed back the broken down boats toward Libyan launches offered by the European Union or European countries, resulting in migrants being beaten, arrested, and confined in prisons in Libya, where torture is commonly practiced and where many disappear. Most of these events remain invisible and victims unknown, as Western countries, especially European ones, have delegated the dirty job of killing or letting die to Global South countries via externalization of repression in Turkey, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, as well as Niger and Libya. In exchange, they provide them funding to reinforce their police and military, thus strengthening authoritarian governments. The reason invoked for these policies is the control of border and the hindrance of irregular migration, even though many of those who attempt these perilous journeys are fleeing violence and persecution and are therefore entitled to asylum requests. But from state's perspective, these people infringe the law and deserve a form of retribution. Although there may be no intention to execute migrants on an individual basis, there is an awareness and an acceptance that the practices induced by their policies will cause, at a collective level, death, sanctioning the illegal entrance on their territory. The pay for their violation of the law is a leitmotif heard among many hardliners in nationalist parties and governments, who even go as far as criminalizing parents for their children's death, or migrants for driving the dinghies, or humanitarian organizations for rescuing shipwrecked. It is therefore not inappropriate, in my mind, to deem these practices as a disguised form of capital punishment. But beyond this general and theoretical statement, I want to provide a specific and empirical material to render it more concrete, more complex, and also probably more nuanced. To do so, I will use a 5-year ethnography that I conducted with the sociologist Anne-Claire de Fossé at the border between Italy and France in the Alps, using participant observation at a shelter hosting migrants in the Valley of Briançon and observant participation as volunteer in rescue operation at the Montgenèvre Pass. conversations with 90 migrants about their experience along the journey from Africa or the Middle East, and interviews with law enforcement officers and commanders, as well as human rights activists and humanitarian workers. It is their fourth time trying to cross the border. On the 3 previous occasions, they were stopped by the French police and sent back to the Italian side. The first attempt was the most grueling. The Iranian man, his 8-month pregnant wife, and their 9-year-old son had taken the bus that runs from Oulx in the Val di Susa to Briançon via the Montgenèvre Pass, one of the most accessible in the Alps. Like all the migrants attempting to go over the pass, they got off the bus at Clavière, the last Italian village, before crossing into the French territory. They waited for night, as they had been advised. Another Iranian family they had met a few days earlier was with them. At 1 o'clock, they finally set out on a hiking path. To avoid the border, they chose to go via the mountainside through the forest. For 3 hours, they walked in the dark on indistinct path, when suddenly, as they crossed a clearing where they thought they were far enough from the police sight, gendarmes, a little below in the valley, who probably spotted them through their night vision binoculars, shouted at them to stop. They started to run. Then they thought they heard a gunshot. They took fright and stopped. Terrified, the pregnant woman started trembling violently, fearing they might be shot. For the next half hour, she remained sitting, unable to speak, trying to pull herself together. The 4 officers came up to them and took them down to the border post, where they were handed over to the police, who registered them, made them sign documents they didn't understand, and explained in rudimentary English that they were being taken back to Italy. At the border post, the pregnant woman complained of abdominal pain and asked to see a doctor. She was close to her due date and was worried that the physical exertion and emotion had stimulated contractions. An officer replied sarcastically that she should not worry, pregnancy was, after all, a natural phenomenon, and there was no need to call a health professional. She was not even given the water she requested. The group was, with the 2 families were then placed in a prefab, furnished with 3 basic beds, 2 tables and blankets for the rest of the night. In the morning, an Italian Red Cross vehicle brought them back to Oulx in Italy. 48 hours later, the 2 families joined forces for another attempt, but they chose a different route. They had been told of a small camp set up by volunteers near the border where they could rest before setting out and be shown the path on the Italian side. They made their way there and were welcomed. At 8 o'clock, they began to climb. An hour and a half later, they were arrested once again and taken back to the border post where the same scenario was repeated. The following day, the man, the wife, and their son set out again, this time alone. They tried out yet another different timing. They set out in the afternoon, taking the same route as the day before and hoping not to meet anybody. But 3 hours later, they were stopped and taken to the border post, where the same officer laughed at their fruitless perseverance. Later, the Italian Red Cross came and drove them back to the refuge in Oulx. So this is their 4th attempt. The earlier failures have certainly done nothing to dissuade them. Originally from Shiraz, they had to leave Iran 2 years earlier, knowing they were in danger, and since then had encountered many other hardships. On the Balkan route, they were confronted with the dreaded Croatian police. They made 25 attempts to cross the border from Bosnia, constantly changing location to increase their chances of getting across. They were arrested, insulted, and humiliated. Several times their possessions were burned and their mobile phone destroyed. The man had been beaten and had his shoes taken away. Yet they did not give up, and on the 26th attempt, they finally succeeded. Given this experience, a few setbacks on the French border would not discourage them. Leaving at dawn, they decide to take a much higher path this time through the woods, moving away from the GPS points their compatriots had given them. The ascent off track over rocky terrain is exhausting. Finally, they come to a forest road and follow it without knowing whether they are going in the right direction. When they see a vehicle in the distance, fearing that it is the police, they rush toward the mountainside and climb up among the trees until they are no longer visible from the road. Exhausted, the woman says she cannot go further. The man realizes that they are lost. They have been walking for 8 hours in what they call the jungle, a generic term for any hostile natural environment among migrants. By chance, although they are far from any human presence, they have a signal on their phone. A few days earlier in Italy, they have met an Iranian aged around 30, Iranian man. They later heard from him that he had succeeded in reaching Briançon. They decide to send him a message asking for help. The young man, Briançon, who has temporary accommodation in the little house hosting migrants in the valley for those who are passing through, and this shelter is called the Solidarity Refuge, informs my colleague and me. Alongside the research that we have been conducting on the border, we volunteer in various capacities at the shelter. She welcomes the new arrivals, registers them, and helps them prepare the next stage of their journey. I provide medical consultation for the sick and injured whose condition does not need hospital treatment, and go out at night on rescue operation to assist people in trouble in the mountain. We therefore decide to go up the pass in search of the Iranian couple. Formerly prohibited, such assistance is now legal, provided that there's, of course, no financial benefit counterparts. However, it remains subject to interception by the police, who take the migrants back to the border and check the identity of the volunteers, sometimes asking for hearings. At the outskirts of Montgenèvre, on the pass, on the French side, we leave our car and set off on the forest road. It is the start of the hiking trail that goes west down to the valley, but the geolocation of their signal soon leads us to fork off, climbing toward mountain massifs well to the south. After an hour and a half walking, we find the three migrants who have been hiding behind large copses, clinging to a steep slope. Reassured by our presence, they join us on the path below, but the woman's state of fatigue makes the going slow. About 50 meters from where we have parked our car, we see a gendarmerie vehicle approaching slowly. The officer stare at us for a moment and then drive on. In truth, as the Iranian woman is blonde, light-skinned, and my colleague is holding the boy's hand, we look like two couples out for a walk. When they arrive at the refuge, the family is taken care of, the woman driven to the hospital, the following day having rested from their exhausting trek and reassured about the state of her pregnancy. They take the train to Paris. From there they go to Calais, where they meet their elder son, who lives in Germany. He arrived some years earlier as an unaccompanied minor, but has not been granted the refugee status he hoped for when he turned 18. The family, finally reunited, tries in vain to get to England. The parents then decide to go to Germany, a country that seems somewhat more welcoming, and where they want to seek asylum together. It is there that the woman gives birth to a little boy in a hospital on the very day they arrive. So by evoking this scene, I want to stress 2 points. First, the scene is an illustration of the violence of the border. The turning back of this Iranian family on 3 occasions leads them to take each time more dangerous path through the mountains until they get lost on the fourth attempt, with the woman being in the last month of her pregnancy. The use of a gun to frighten them, the mocking comment to decline the visit of, to deny the visit of the mother to a doctor, the refusal to give her the water she requests are part of the ordinary of the encounter between migrants and the border police. By comparison, of course, with their terrible previous experiences in Turkey, Greece, and Croatia in particular, one could speak of slow violence. Indeed, it does not involve a direct use of physical force, even if the bodies of the migrants are put to the test by the efforts, the fear, the pain, the thirst, and it manifests the power of the state through endangerment, intimidation, humiliation, bullying, abuse. But remarkably, it is as illegal as it is ineffective. On the one hand, the family is denied the right to file an application for asylum, although they claim being persecuted in Iran, in contradiction with the terms of the 1951 Geneva Convention related to refugees and with a reminder of them by the State Council, which is the highest administrative court in France. The border police rarely take the requests for asylum. On the other hand, the family eventually crosses into France on their fourth attempt. The fact is known by rank-and-file law of enforcement agents as well as by officials at the prefecture. Almost all of those who try end up succeeding. And it should be noted in passing the contradiction of the French policies, which in the Alps prevent migrants from entering the country and later in Calais prevent them from leaving it to reach England. Second point, the scene brings together the three main protagonists at the border, the migrant, the police, and the activist. On this border, although it is one of the two entry points in the southeast of France for migrants coming from the Middle East, especially Afghan families from sub-Saharan Africa, often as unaccompanied minors, and from North Africa, these migrants are relatively few, approximately 4,000 people each year, corresponding to an average of about 10 per 24 hours, although there can be peak as many as 50 passages. With time, the border police have rapidly strengthened so the second protagonist, have rapidly strengthened in a context of increasing state xenophobia, and the area has been militarized in a disproportionate manner considering the actual number of crossings. The total presence of law enforcement has thus increased in a few years from 60 to 250, including gendarmerie squadrons and anti-terrorist units with more and more sophisticated material. And finally, third protagonist, volunteers, initially inhabitants of the region, refusing to let people die in the mountain, that's what they say, and they therefore went out to rescue them and offer them hospitality, were soon joined by activists from the whole country and even beyond, with humanitarian and or political ideals, sometimes strongly disagreeing among themselves on the ultimate goal of solidarity. Inserting my colleague and myself in this scene was meant to show the sort of ethnography we conducted, combining three modes of positionality: involvement, in the sense of participating in the activity of solidarity organizations in various ways; commitment, with the implication that migrants should be treated with respect for their rights and their dignity; and detachment, by attempting to account for the facts and the logics underlying them and to offer an understanding of them, regardless of the degree of sympathy with some or others. So this triad, involvement, commitment, detachment, and you can see that it's Norbert Elias +1. This triad is in some way my understanding of critical positionality in the field. So in the story of the Iranian family, after three failed attempts, the couple and their son succeeded in crossing the border after being lost and found. Most migrants do succeed after one or several tries, as I said before. But not all of them. And some lose their lives. Blessing Matthew was 21, the youngest of 9 brothers and sisters. She spent her childhood in a village of southern Nigeria. After graduating from high school, she left her country with one of her sisters, but they became separated during the journey. She stayed in Italy for a year and a half, and probably as a result of the coming to power of the far right, with an interior minister who implemented very restrictive measures against migrants, she decided to make her way to France. On the 7th of May 2018, she became the first migrant to die in the Hautes-Alpes. It was the middle of the night. She was with 2 African companions she had met a little before. A group of gendarmes, hidden on the side of the road, saw them and started to chase them. The 3 migrants ran, but she was exhausted after hours of walking and lost ground on her pursuers. As she was close to be caught, she tried to cross the river and drowned in the strong currents. Her body was found 2 days later in the sluice gate of a hydroelectric dam, 13 kilometers downstream of the place where she fell in. 11 days later, Mamadi Condé, a 31-year-old Guinean man, was also found dead not far from the place where the young woman drowned. A week later, Mohamed Fofana, another Guinean man, 18 years old, was discovered on the other side of the pass. The 3 deaths, in less than a month, were the first to happen at the Alpine border between Italy and France. They occurred only a few days after the arrival of the first mobile squadrons of 70 gendarmes dispatched to reinforce the border police. It was difficult to consider it to be a mere coincidence, because 2 years later, when a second mobile squadron was added, 3 other migrants met their death in a few weeks. In total, 12 have died or disappeared in the past 7 years around the Montgenèvre Pass. In addition, there are also those who have been injured or amputated because of frostbites. But long before they reach the Italian-French border, where we met them, migrants had many experiences of the violence of the policing of the border. There are 2 main ways, as you probably know, to reach Western Europe: from the south, across the Sahara; from the east, the Balkan route. For migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa, the entire journey has become extremely dangerous. Armed groups stop the vehicles loaded with migrants and extort money from them, beating them up when they do not have any. Border police also practice racketeering and thrashing. In Libya, it is even difficult to differentiate the two, as the 2011 Western military intervention that led to the fall of the Gaddafi regime resulted in the destabilization of the country, the dissemination of weapons, and the proliferation of militias that maintain an ambiguous relationship with various government officials and ministers, as well as with law enforcement institutions. The question of whether the abuses of migrants are committed by the police or by gangs is therefore hard to resolve. Thus, on its way to Tripoli, a little convoy of 21 migrants was stopped by an armed group that fired Kalashnikov shots to frighten the passengers and strip them of their money and cell phones. A little later, when they arrived in the Libyan capital, they were intercepted again, this time by what they describe as the real police. They were imprisoned. 2 were sold to Libyan men, who chose the strongest among them, while the other 19 were sent to construction work or other tasks. Indeed, when migrants are unable to pay their ransom, they are kept prisoner, often battered, sometimes tortured, and in the case of women, raped. Some are sold to rich Libyans who use them as odd job men until they have repaid through their labor the price of getting them out of prison. Whereas the others are put to work, those in rural jails being sent to farms, those imprisoned in urban environments being used at building sites, in both cases under the surveillance of armed guards. So when the Frontex launches pushback dinghies full of migrants to Libyan waters, or when its planes transmit information about their presence to Libyan coast guards, this is what the European Union exposed these men, women, and children to: inhuman and degrading treatment prohibited under the Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. In Morocco and Algeria, deterrence practices are cruel as well. The police constantly harass migrants, take their money, and brutally expel them into the Sahara. Thus, in May 2022, as an example, between 40 and 90 people were arrested every day in the Moroccan town of Laayoune and deported 1,000 kilometers to the south. And in February 2023, another example, over a 10-day period, the Algerian authorities conducted raids and sent back almost 3,000 migrants, including women and children, into the middle of the desert, 15 kilometers from the nearest Nigerian village, without food or water. While black minorities have long been subject to racism and discrimination in North Africa, this official xenophobia has been reinforced by European Union injunctions to governments to ensure that borders are controlled in exchange of funds. The latest country embarked in this repression has been Tunisia. On 16th July 2023, the President of the European Commission, accompanied by the Dutch and Italian Prime Ministers, signed a partnership agreement with the Tunisian president, promising major financial aid, including more than $100 million dedicated to border control. That is, to the police. A few days after the ceremony, a photo went viral around the world, which you probably have seen, that of a woman and her little girl who had died of thirst in the desert, to which they had been expelled with hundreds of other women, men, and children, including students and asylum seekers legally in Tunisia, by order of the authorities, and had been abandoned in 49 degrees heat. It was reported that they had tried 5 times to cross the Mediterranean. These two, the mother and the child, had tried 5 times to cross the Mediterranean from Libya in the hope of giving the child a good education. Other bodies were found, women, men, children who had died in similar circumstances. In fact, this deportation operation had begun on the 2nd of July, that is 2 weeks before the signing of the agreement. But of course, Africa does not have the monopoly of violent policing for those who come from the Middle East, be it Syria, Iran, or Afghanistan, after the often trying time in Turkey, where some are shot at the border while others are deported back in their country. There is the Balkan route. Some attempt crossing the Aegean Sea with the risk of being pushed back by Greek coast guards or Frontex launches, which have caused death, although the majority of those who died drowned due to overcrowded boats. Others choose to travel overland, but the crossing of the Meric or Evros, depending on which side it's called, river between the two countries exposes them also to the risk of drowning as a result of being pushed back by the Greek police. A forensic pathologist recorded over 660 deaths in 22 years of practice on the Greek side, and although the numbers on the Turkish side are unknown, he believes it reasonable to imagine that there are at least as many on the other bank. The river is not the only obstacle on this border, since Greece has built a high fence topped by barbed wire and monitored by drones and the military. But preventing people from crossing is often not enough for the police. Before sending them back, some strip, beat, and humiliate the men and sometimes the women. A Moroccan who tried 3 times to cross and was stopped on his first 2 attempts, showed me a video he recorded of men in underwear going back up the river. While most on this video, most hide their face in shame, others reveal the camera, their lacerated back and swollen eyes, stigmata of the blows received. In certain documented cases, the Greek police were accused of drowning migrants by forcing them to get into the water when they told them they did not know how to swim, or of gathering women and men in a warehouse and undressing them all. To physical violence was added the psychological violence of degrading treatments. However, those who take the Balkan route have to enter the European not once, but at least twice, since after Greece, they have to go through Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro, Bosnia, which are not part of the Union, and most then try to enter Croatia, although some now go through Hungary. The crossing of this border is described by the dozens of migrants I spoke to as the most painful and debasing experience of those punishing years. All the more because repeated failures lead to reiterated attempts, exposing them over and over to the same ordeals. While the majority of migrants made 5 to 10 tries, an Afghan couple in their 30s mentioned 47. They describe having their phone taken, their belongings burnt, and being beaten up and sent back in underwear. Often, men would show me the photos of themselves or their companions on the road with the marks of assaults they had been subjected to on their bodies and face. One Iranian man who received a head injury also had his arm and leg broken, for which he was treated in a Bosnian hospital and after being pushed back. Women are not spared this violence. One 8-month pregnant Afghan woman had to be transferred to a maternity for an emergency cesarean after having been beaten. Several described how they, sometimes together with their children, witnessed the violence inflicted on their husbands and begged the persecutors for mercy. A report by the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman and Degrading Treatment or Punishments detailed many cases of violence, giving official credence to this testimony, which are refuted by the political authorities. In addition to the long list of physical assaults, it mentions migrants being terrorized by officers firing bullets close to their bodies while they lay on the ground, being thrown into the river with their hands ziplocked together, or being pushed back and forced to march barefoot through the forest, wearing only their underwear or even naked. Despite the evidence provided by humanitarian organizations and independent inquiries, both Greek and Croatian governments deny such abuses, and European leaders often praise them for their border control. In March 2020, 2 days after the Greek government announced it was suspending the right to asylum for people entering their country, ordering the expulsion of new arrivals and replacing reception centers by detention centers, the president of the European Commission described Greece as Europe's shield, implicitly setting up migrants as enemies. Similarly, in November 2021, just before taking up the presidency of the European Union for a 6-month term, the French head of state made a historic visit to Croatia, during which he congratulated the government for its anti-immigration policy. By comparison with what they have gone through in Libya and Tunisia or Greece and Croatia, one could be tempted, as I mentioned before, to minimize the experience of migrants at the border between Italy and France. Yet it is quite stressful and sometimes even traumatic. An investigation was conducted by a local activist who documented dozens of disturbing accounts. In one of them, a 21-year-old man stated that he was crossing in the mountain the mountain in the snow at night with two companions when they were surrounded by police snowmobiles. They were told by one of the officers that there was no place for them in France and were taken to the border post, stripped and searched, and asked to sign the refusal of entry document, which they did not agree to. The officers signed for them and handed them over to the Italian police, who put them on a train to Milan. 2 days later, they tried again, were stopped by the same officers who hurled racist slurs and beat them with batons. In another case, a 20-year-old man, accompanied by 5 youth, testified that they were stopped also by police officers on snowmobiles. At the border post, they were placed in separate rooms and told to empty their pockets. The young man had a cell phone and $400. The phone was returned to him, but not the money. He complained in vain. The same happened to one of his companions, who was robbed of €300. It sometimes happened that officers disapproved the conduct of a violent colleague. A 17-year-old youth, confident of his right because he knew that minors were supposed to be taken to social services in Europe, presented himself to the officer on duty at the border post. He showed the officer his Cameroonian birth certificate, proving his age. The officer took the document and tore it up in front of him, telling him that it was forgery. A colleague, looking shocked, intervened, reminding the officer that this was a minor who should be taken to the social services. The officer did not care. He took the boy back to the border, threatening him if he tried to come back, and when they got to the Italian side, threw his bags on the road. Another colleague, who was with them, feeling embarrassed, put his hand on the youth's shoulder and wished him luck. 5 of these reports were sent to a lawyer, the most obvious ones, best documented ones, who the lawyer passed them on to the prosecutor, who simply dismissed the case. Arrest at the border result from 2 forms of action: ambush and chase. In the first case, officers hide behind a tree and catch people by surprise when they come out. In the second, they pursue migrants, sometimes with the advantage of a vehicle, such as snowmobile in winter. Ambush often precedes a chase. Both are methods characteristic of synergetic practices with a strong resemblance between police and hunters. In fact, volunteers often use the expression manhunt to describe the activity of border patrols. This expression arouses angry reactions from officers who see them as defamatory. Yet each day and each night, they are laying traps for migrants in the mountain, and it is indeed as a result of chases that they manage to catch some of them. In these circumstances, migrants sometimes get injured or die. In 2017, 2 African men who were climbing up to a pass saw a gendarmerie vehicle arrive, and officers get out and run after them. They took fright and fled, but in the darkness on a rocky ridge, they fell 40 meters into the ravine. One of them sustained a serious head injury, for which he had brain surgery, and from which he still has serious after effects several years later, with 80% incapacity. The other suffered multiple wounds to his body and face and was treated in a clinic. But these practices are not conducted purely on the agent's initiative, although there is always a discretionary element to their activity as any police activity. In principle, this work consists in applying the law. It is the state that defines the conditions of illegal residence, and the government that decides to implement measures for pushing back migrants. It seems then that officers are right when they say that they are only fulfilling the task they have been given. Even more so because the Ministry of the Interior has imposed in the past 2 decades a numbers policy which establishes quota of arrest and incentivizes competition between squads, rewarding some with bonuses and retributing others with denigration. And in fact, one of them committed suicide after having not good enough results, and he left a letter that was indicated to me, in which he explained that was the reason of his committing suicide. However, this strictly rational reading that I'm giving now passes over a specific emotional dimension of what takes place in the mountain when an officer hides to catch migrants by surprise, dazzles them with his lamp, runs after them, captures them, and takes them to the border. There is more than the satisfaction of a job well done. It is about pleasure and even excitement that can lead some to violence, insults, and threats. In that regard, one element cannot be understated: the ideological leaning of law enforcement officers in France. In 2017, a survey found that 41% of gendarmes and 54% of the police in France voted for the far-right candidate in the first round of the presidential election. That is 2.5 and 3.5 respectively, more than the rest of the population. Among active rank-and-file police, it was even 67%. In other words, if the composition of border patrols is similar to that of the national sample, a migrant who is arrested in the Alps has 2 out of 3 chances to face an officer with strong affinities with a xenophobic party. And one might even think that the police who choose to work in border control are more inclined than the average to a certain hostility toward migrants, which contributes to their aggressiveness. But of course, not all officers share these views. Sometimes by mere compassion towards the dire condition of migrants, as they told me, sometimes by hidden disapproval of repressive policies against them, they turn a blind eye and even help those in difficulty. For instance, I know of one who stopped to take migrants, discovered on the side of a snowbound road within the border zone where he was supposed to arrest them, and took them to the shelter in Briançon. Another checked a couple of local residents who had picked up a hitchhiking undocumented man and let them go after telling them he had seen nothing and advising them to take their passenger to safety. A third warned a non-profit organization of an impending police raid on the railroad station, enabling those who had planned to go there that evening to avoid arrest. A migrant recounts how on the New Year's Day, on the train from Ventimiglia to Nice, he saw police officers getting on at one stop. They asked him for his ticket, and when he said he did not have one, they replied, "You're good, Happy New Year," and let him continue his journey. Even if these gestures are definitely unusual, they are probably more common than one could think, since those who do offer them do not boast of it. Whereas it is undoubtedly a rare example of benevolence, an anecdote that a police officer told me is quite revealing. I had got to know him, and to know him relatively well, after I had been arrested while rescuing 2 Afghan families on a very cold winter night. During the hearing, he had expressed his criticisms of the policies against migrants and his sympathy for the work being done by volunteers. In fact, at first I thought that he was playing the good cop, bad cop, and that he was the good one. So I didn't trust him. But later I did. And one night, he tells me, in the border post, he saw an Afghan woman who had been arrested with her three young children. It was her fourth attempt. He looked at her with empathy and embarrassment. He knew that he was supposed to deny her entry, which would mean being sent back the following morning. He told the translator to ask the woman to say that she was not feeling well. After the woman had repeated what she was requested to say, to the surprise of the translator, he wrote down her statement in the report and called the emergency paramedics to have her taken to the hospital in the valley with her children. The following day, the family was transferred to the shelter. When he arrived in his office the next morning, the director of the border force expressed his astonishment and discontent. Feeling unwell, she was putting it on. The officer replied as naively as he could, "I don't know, that's what she told me." But beyond these individual gestures, there is a structural paradox in the state activities of the border, since apart from the heavy repressive presence of law enforcement, there are two units, one from the police, the other from the gendarmerie, which are dedicated to rescue people endangered, be they tourists, mountaineers, or even migrants. These highly specialized officers do not make difference between the various categories of persons they assist, sometimes even taking risk to extricate them from difficult situations. In a conversation with the captain in charge of one of these units, the police rescue unit, I asked him what he thought about having to rescue people who had taken risks to escape his colleagues. He began defensively. I can answer that question. He hesitated for a moment, and then he added thoughtfully, "Well, it is true that if we let them cross by the road, there wouldn't be a problem." This was indeed an absurd situation because migrants were not the only ones put in danger, as rescuers also pay a high cost in human lives. And he recalled me, the captain recalled me that, reminded me that it was one of the most dangerous professions. So for centuries, borders were mostly protected. So to conclude, for centuries, borders were mostly protected from the incursions of enemies. Today, they are guarded against migrants, many of whom have fled their country for fear of persecution or violence, and are therefore legitimate candidates to a refugee status, while others have left because of pauperization and lack of a decent future. In some cases, the political and economic situation that forces them to migrate is the consequence of policies led by the very countries where they hope to find a refuge. The diversification of instruments deployed to ensure border control, both legal and technological, has significantly increased the dangers for migrants. On the legal side, the externalization of policing to authoritarian regime has rendered brutality, torture, and even killings almost systematic, yet invisible to the public. On the technological side, the use of ships, planes, drones, carbon dioxide detectors, electrified fences with camera oblige those who have embarked on these long peregrinations to take significant risks. But two things are really remarkable about this politics of violence. First, it is directed against people who not only have not committed any crime, but are themselves exposed to criminal activities, both in their country of origin and during their trying journey. Victims, they are more and more treated as offenders. While what is often referred to by criminologists as crimigration, which involves a punishment of illegal entry and stay, as well as much more severe sentences for migrants than for nationals in case of minor charges, as you know, the punitive trend is today extended both geographically, beyond the Mediterranean in the case of Europe, and empirically through exposure to abuses and even death. And second, it is little effective in relation with its proclaimed objective of preventing migrants to come, since having had major reasons to undertake their journey and having suffered many hardships, they rarely renounce their project unless they are killed or left to die. On the contrary, their ill treatment in the countries they traverse render their urgent need to continue even more pressing. But the actual objective of these policies is probably not deterrence. It is performance. In a time of growing inequality and declining social justice in many countries, migrants constitute easy prey for nationalist and populist parties whose ideology have become hegemonic. The spectacle of their punitive action definitely has electoral payoffs. The regulation of migration has been described as a biopolitics, and rightly so. However, it has also become, for many migrants, a Thanatopolitics, which, as mentioned earlier, can be assimilated to a form of death penalty inflicted by European countries directly or indirectly. It has two components. First, there are those who are killed at the border, be this border a line between two countries in Greece or Croatia, or an entire territory between two continents in Libya and Tunisia. And second, there are those who are left to die in the Sahara through the financing of their repression, or in the Mediterranean through the hindering humanitarian rescue operation. To justify this Thanatopolitics, victims are blamed, their retribution being legitimized as a protection of Western country from the barbarians, to use the word of Constantin Cavafy in his famous 1904 poem. This comes down to punishing the innocent. Thank you.